Welcome to BSL Session 2. A couple of weeks ago, a young friend of mine talked to me. She was frustrated. She'd been trying to read through the Bible, and she'd started with Genesis, but before long, she'd gotten bogged down. What's with this Old Testament? I don't get it. I don't see why it's so important. It just seems so strange. My guess is that many people who have tried to read the Old Testament have felt like this young woman. At the center of the Christian faith is our declaration that Jesus Christ is Lord, and that story is told in the New Testament. So why bother with the Old? Good question. And I hope that as we go through these sessions, you will come up with some ways to answer that question for yourself. Let me give you my first answer. The Old Testament tells us the story of God's relationship with God's people, and that story reaches its climax in Jesus. We can't appreciate or understand why Jesus came and who Jesus was without this story. We will find more answers as we go along to enlarge and enrich this general answer. So, I invite you now, let's get to it. This session, our second session in this series, is called The Story of Loss. Last session, we looked at Genesis 1 and 2, the Bible's primary stories of creation. Let me mention now a few of our highlights. In Genesis 1, we read the marvelous story of a powerful God of order and justice who can create by the power of the Word. In Genesis 1, 26 and 27, we are told that God created human beings in God's own image. Preachers and theologians argue about what that phrase means. In what ways are human beings like God? What makes us different from the rest of creation? Is it creativity? Is it intelligence? How about the power of speech? Or the ability to give and receive love? Or maybe it's the capacity to have a relationship with God. What do you think it is? The capacities, the possibilities, I should say, are really endless. Then we read in Genesis 1:28 that God gives a special charge to human beings. Again, these verses have been interpreted in many different ways over the years. Human beings are called to subdue and have dominion over the earth. Is that license to destroy and deface what God has created? Is it license to reshape creation strictly for human purposes? If we are in God's image, then how do we exercise dominion? You can see that the Bible's creation stories really do lay out some deep questions about who we are and how we are related to God's creation. Look now at Genesis 1, verse 31. God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. At every step of creation, God announces it was good. This is another biblical affirmation. The universe that God created was good. It was all good. But the world we live in is not all good. Every time we turn on the TV, every time we open up a newspaper or surf the web, we are reminded that this world has darkness, suffering, death, and pain. What happened? If God's creation was all very good, where did all of this ungood stuff come from? Almost every culture and religion has a way of explaining why the world is the way it is. The Bible's explanation is told in Genesis 3 through 12. The stories in these chapters are more than just a few incidents in the lives of individuals like Adam, Eve, and Noah. These stories are in the Bible to help us understand ourselves and understand our world. They are meant to be universal stories. One clue we have that these are universal stories is the very name given to the first man. Adam is the Hebrew word that means mankind. These really are stories about us. Genesis 3. I invite you now to turn to that chapter. It tells the story of Adam and Eve and the serpent. Traditionally, it is called the temptation story or the story of the fall. The fall refers to what happens to Adam and Eve. They fall out of a relationship with God, and they fall into disobedience. The serpent that we meet in Genesis 3 isn't quite what we later will call Satan or the devil, but we certainly can see in this serpent the first hint of resistance to God's will and power. Look how this classic story begins. First, there is a subtle questioning in verse 1. Then a questioning of God's motives. This leads the woman to decide that she and not God will decide what is good and not good. This is the fall. She trusted in her own ability to choose good from evil, and she doubted that God had her own best interests at heart. Adam and Eve put themselves in the place of God. They want to climb up higher than creatures were created to be, and they end up falling below what they were created to be. Once they disobeyed, they became subhuman, less than God created them. The immediate results of their sin? Well, they suddenly realize they are naked. This is a powerfully symbolic way of saying they were ashamed. They sensed that they were now vulnerable before God. They had lost that grace-filled, confident relationship, and so when God shows up, they run and hide. Whenever I read these verses, I think of that TV ad in which someone does something stupid or destructive, and the off-camera voice says, "Want to get away?" After they disobeyed God's command, that is exactly what Adam and Eve wanted to do. The story shows us that all of sinful humanity runs and hides because it fears the judgment of God. What happens now? What follows? In the verses, chapter 3, verses 10 through 13, you could say is a classic case of passing the buck. Adam blames Eve. Eve blames the snake. And, well, we all know, don't we, who it was that created the snake. God now hands out punishment to the snake, to the woman, and to the man. In each case, look at how the punishments describe the world in which we live. Pain, suffering, fruitless labor, domination, strife. We see that even the ground has been cursed. All of these things have been unleashed by humankind's unwillingness to trust God and God's goodwill. Humans are now banished from the garden, estranged from God. But the story gives us a hint that despite human disobedience, God has not completely written them off. Verse 21 of chapter 3 gives us just a hint of the love that God still feels for God's creation. God becomes a tailor for Adam and Eve and makes these poor, miserable, shame-filled children the beginning of a wardrobe.